A pacifist society is morally and practically superior to one using defensive violence. Bob, you should get up. Do you want to? You can do it from the podium or from your chair. I always give everybody their option of where how they want to do it. You want to do it from the podium? That's good. I think you're probably more comfortable. Bob has 15 minutes to establish the case for that resolution. A pacifist society is morally and practically superior to one using defensive violence.
So what I'm going to try to do here in the beginning is just frame this, because I'm sure most people agree with Tom at the start of this. And so let me go through some things and try to show you what I'm not going to be doing here, and you know where you won't be making these observations. All right, and so I think there's a lot of misconceptions. I've been debating this kind of stuff informally and on online venues for a long time, and I see there's a lot of knee-jerk reaction and rejection of it, so let me just try to diffuse that at the outset. So number one, most importantly, what I'm arguing here in no way conflicts with standard libertarian theory. Okay, I'm not saying you don't have the right to respond with violence if somebody initiates aggression against you. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it's morally and practically superior if you don't use violence. So just as an analogy or an illustration of that, under standard libertarian theory, if we caught somebody who had tortured and killed someone, well then I think it's at least an open question. I believe it would be permissible that we could take the person, torture and kill him over the course of several hours, and have it a televised pay-per-view event. And we could say that's what ANCAP is all about, right? And so if I were now saying, I think it would be morally and practically superior if we didn't have the Rothbardian society that did that sort of thing, and we dealt with homicidal, killers differently, then you can at least see where I was coming from, right? And so in that kind of case, I would say it's just better, let's not do that. Even though we have the right to, let's refrain from torturing someone over hours and then killing them for a live audience. That's just, there's no reason to do that. We're better than that, we're above that. And also, if somebody then tried to argue, oh, but if we don't do that, we're just sitting ducks for a bunch of torturers, and we're just going to be overrun with torturing and killing because we're not threatening to reciprocate. And you can see how I would just say, no, empirically, I don't think that's true. All right, so that's the kind of argument I'm making here. Now, I realize I'm drawing the line in a much different spot, where I'm saying, not only do I think we shouldn't torture someone for hours on end and then kill them, I think we should try to conduct ourselves in a way that doesn't even hurt other people. Okay, so that's what I'm doing. So you can see there, that doesn't have anything to do with libertarianism. That first debate about the hypothetical one about should we torture and kill someone who's a convicted torturer and murderer over televised events, that really has nothing to do with libertarian theory. That's just an argument beyond that. It stipulates libertarian theory for the sake of argument. So that's what's going on here. Also, I am not here making a personal appeal in terms of personal values or ethics. I am not trying to tell you right now, you in the real world today should become a pacifist. That's a separate and related question, of course, but that's not what the resolution says. What we're talking about right now for this debate is, imagine two societies consisting of Rothbardians, or people who agree to the non-aggression principle, and then Tom is going to be arguing, I think society A that relies on defensive violence is going to be better both practically and morally to the other one, and I'm going to say, no, actually, I think there's a better way. So we have two societies, all of the major people in them, the institutions and so forth, are respecting the non-aggression principle, and then we're just now differing in details, and I'm saying let's actually push it further. Not only do we not initiate aggression, not only do we not use violence against innocent people, let me show you that actually we could survive and it would be fine if we didn't use violence even against violent people. And moreover, I think not only would we be fine, but we'd be prosper relative to Tom's society he's going to describe for you. And on top of that, can't we all agree that this would be a better way to do it? Another misconception people have, they think that pacifism is this real wishy-washy and just, oh man, I don't like to hurt people, and it's not, it's just like emotional, and it's not real hardcore, real politics. The war hawks, they're the ones that sit down and really think things through. They know how the world works, they're not naive, and that's not the case. There's plenty of examples of people who adopt strategies and tactics of nonviolent resistance. So they're not doormats. They're not Ned Flanders. Hey, you're gonna tax me? Okay, that's not what they're doing, right? It's a strategic consideration. It's oftentimes not because of moral considerations, but because of power politics. That certain movements realize we are vastly outgunned and outnumbered. If we take this to a physical confrontation of might, of military prowess, we are going to get wiped out. And so that's why we're going to adopt this other strategy. And by the way, Rothbardians in the United States right now, the way they deal with systematic theft is we do things like start podcasts and go on cruises. Okay, so Tom's doing a performative contradiction if he's saying, oh, the way we're going to stop aggression is by taking up arms. That's actually not how modern libertarians work, because they realize that's not going to work in this particular situation. All right, so just notice that right there. And what I'm saying is that I think that it's in more situations, more scenarios than many people commonly believe, where actually nonviolence is the right thing to do. And just to give you more examples of this, so of course there's things like, the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King famously, preaching nonviolence as a way to sort of change the institutions and the policies of white America. And if they had just followed like the Black Panther model, a lot of people think that wouldn't have worked. They would have lost credibility, they would have lost public sympathy, and they would have been discredited. Gandhi, another famous example of using nonviolent resistance. So again, that word resistance, this is not just rolling over and letting bad people do whatever they want and we just sit there and take it. There's ways of opposing evil without hurting other people, and that's what we're talking about here today. Another example, sit-ins. So this was very organized. There was a museum in Nashville that went through the history of this. So they would, when they were like boycotting lunch counters, they're having sit-ins for places that were segregated, and crowds would come up and start beating them. And so the tactics they used, they went to sessions and trained for this, is they said, okay, you're gonna sit there and take it, and then when the people on the outer ring have had enough, we rotate. So the people on the interior of doing this sit-in who haven't been punched in the face yet, they swap and say, hey, okay, my turn now. And they say things like, engage the person attacking. We ask them, why are you hitting me? Why are you spitting at me? Because that kind of humanizes you, and it's hard to keep punching someone who's having a conversation with you, right? That's kind of thing going on. So that, again, you can say it's silly or not, but it was not just a spontaneous, let's just show up and sit at the lunch. No, they trained for this stuff because they knew if we show up with guns, the police are going to take us out, and white America is going to say, yeah, it's a bunch of rabble rousers, and good, they had it coming, right? So again, it's a strategic thing. This guy, Gene Sharp, this book is called Civilian-Based Defense, a Post-Military Weapons System. All right, he's been called the Clausewitz of nonviolent resistance. So this guy's whole career, academic career, was based on studying historical cases of groups that were using nonviolent resistance, either against an internal domestic oppressive tyranny or an outside military force that came in. So again, this is very systematic. You can say it's wrong, but it's not just wishy-washy, like, oh, let's just all love each other, and it's the serious, hard-nosed people willing to use violence. They're the ones that think things through. That's a false dichotomy. Let me also stress that there's this idea that, pacifism flows from weakness or cowardice. And no, that's certainly not what I'm talking about here. So there's plenty of examples of this. For example, the case of Desmond Doss. If you've seen that Mel Gibson movie, Hacksaw Ridge, it's about a conscientious objector. He was a Seventh-day Adventist. He volunteered for World War II as a medic, and he refused to pick up a rifle. Okay, so it's a true story. Mel Gibson made the movie, and if you haven't seen it, go look at it. It's fascinating. I won't spoil it. But in the beginning, his comrades and like the drill sergeant and his commanding officer assume he's a coward. Like, oh, you're afraid to go fight. Why don't you step back and let the men take over? Wuss. And that's clearly, I don't want to spoil it, but you'll see this guy, though he didn't pick up a gun against the Japanese, what he did was amazing acts of courage, and such that everybody was in awe of the guy by the end of it. Again, it's a true story. Another example for those who are Christian, the Bible says that when, at the Garden of Gethsemane, and then the crowd come to arrest Jesus, and one of the people on Jesus' side, some accounts say it's Peter, takes his sword off, cuts off the chief priest's servant's ear, and Jesus said, I'm paraphrasing, put your sword back in its sheath. He who lives by the sword dies by the sword. So that's the famous part. But then what he says right after that is, or do you think that I could not now call upon my Father who would send 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled? Okay, so Jesus is telling him, yeah, you don't need to use a sword. If we were going to settle this with violence, believe me, I've got it under control. I'm the Son of God. I got it. These guys with their clubs, I can take them. That's not what I'm trying to do here. Okay, so again, there, you would not say of that, oh yeah, gee, are you afraid, are you afraid to fight? What kind of carpenter are you? That's not what's going on here. Okay, and in some accounts, there's like Jesus' words were so intimidating that the people fell over just from the words that he uttered, okay? Another illustration of this, how many people have seen the movie Rob Roy? Okay, a few of you. Okay, I'll be real fast with this. There's a great scene, one of my favorite scenes of movie history, where Robert Roy McGregor, the Scottish Highlander, and he kills this cattle thief in the beginning of the movie, and then they're in a bar, and this guy comes up to him, and says, "Are you Rob Roy?" And he says, "I am." He says, "Well, I'm Will Guthrie. Have you heard of me?" He says, "I have not." He said, "Well, I heard of you." "And what have you heard?" "I heard you backstabbed Tom Sybil." So Tom Sybil was the guy he killed. And he said, "Was Tom kin of yours?" And he said, "Near enough, I shagged his sister." And then, and so, this is PG-13, sorry guys. And then there's a guy, like a creepy, lascivious guy that Rob was doing business with, somewhat reluctantly, and that guy said, "Likely so did Tom," right? Shagged Tom's sister. And so the guy who knew Tom Sybil takes his sword out and points at the guy's face. So Rob's sitting here, Rob Roy's sitting here, this other guy's here, the guy's standing and has the sword, and he's yelling at the guy, like, "Don't you better take that back." So the whole bar now gets quiet, because this guy pulled his sword out, and whoa. And so then Rob's just being real, he's not even looking at the guy, he's just looking straight forward. It's Liam Neeson, by the way, playing him, the character. And he says, "What's your business with me, Guthrie?" And he turns the sword now, pointing right at Rob's face. He says, "Business best done outside." And he says, "We have no quarrel." And he says, "That can be remedied." And then Rob's like, he's drinking, he's as cool as a cucumber, and he says, "The first cut?" And he says, "Aye." So the sword's sitting there, Rob takes his hand, runs it against the guy's sword, and shows the thin line of blood on his fingers, and goes, "Well done." And the crowd goes, "Ah!" And they realize like how he just burned the guy. Then Liam Neeson stands up, and he's a big guy, grabs the guy, and says, "Maybe some other time, when we're both sober." And just walks out of the bar. And the guy who was trying to fight, is just shocked. He didn't even know what just happened. Okay, and so that is my model here for what I'm saying. When I saw that, I was like, that is the coolest thing I've ever seen in movie history. How he handled that situation. So he would have had the right to kill the guy. The guy was threatening him, sticking a sword in his face, saying, "Let's go settle this outside." If Rob had gone and killed him, Murray Rothbard would have been fine with that. He wouldn't have violated libertarian. But you see how what they were showing, and the point of that scene was to say this guy, Rob Roy, uses violence very sparingly, even though he's a total badass, right? And so that's showing was huge strength and ability to hurt others, but you refrain from doing it because you're classy, you're above that. So that's what I'm talking about here. The sense in which you can say, yeah, the way Rob Roy, the fictional character in this thing, handled that interaction is morally and practically superior, right? In general, if you can diffuse situations like that, that's great. Now, in fairness, and Tom might try to point this out, so let me just get out of the back. Rob Roy's not a pacifist, right? And then you watch that movie, there's plenty of times that he does draw his own sword. But my point is what they were trying to show there is that's the kind of guy he is, because you realize, oh yeah, you can see why people would follow him, because he's got a very cool head and only uses violence as a last resort. And so I'm just saying, take that. The way you can appreciate why that was morally and practically superior to somebody who's like, "You're gonna stick a sword in my face? Well, let me show you, buddy," and kill the guy. And so you gotta do that, because otherwise people go around sticking swords in your face. And I'm saying, no, it was morally and practically superior the way he handled it. That's the message I'm telling you here. Now, as far as the logistics of it, I hope enough of you, or plenty of you, have heard. I tried to get out some of this because I knew it was going to be impossible for me to make the whole case in a 15-minute opening. So I talked about some of this on my podcast. But I think that what we're doing here, I'm describing what's going to happen. Okay, that this is the evolution of what's going to happen if we ever did get a Rothbardian type society, because they're going to be so rich as long as they can survive and last through the infancy. They're going to be so rich that these types of solutions are just going to be the natural outgrowth. So when it comes to, an analogy would be, they were telling us at Ketchikan, I think, that the way they deal with bears that get into garbage, the first thing they do is they tranquilize them, then they put them in a net and helicopter them over to some island, drop them off, and then if the bear comes back a second time, then they put them down. Okay, so you can see that clearly was not how people handled it in the year 1700, right? That was way too expensive. They did not just kill the thing. All right, and also here, notice they don't take the bear back 10 times, or they don't like build some island somewhere for seasteading to bring the bears to. But you can see how, yeah, we're rich enough that we'll give the bear, one strike and you're fine, but 2 strikes and you're out. Okay, you see how that works? So likewise, I'm saying that's the natural evolution. Because again, in that community, shooting bears, people would be squeamish about that. They would say, oh no, we don't want to do that. So likewise, the way agencies would deal with crime, it would be bad for business if you violently took out a shoplifter, right? So the police would all have, body armor, nets, things like that, foam guns, that they would non-violently take out criminals, because that would just be better for business. The community would be fine. So once it becomes technologically feasible, that's what they would do. Okay, again, you said, okay, what about military defense? I could see how bank robbers and say, yeah, you can handle them without like shootouts in the street, but some nation sends in an army. Okay, I'm Ron's hand, we're gonna be quick. I'll try to elaborate more on this in the next section, but technologically speaking, they would have hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of our money to be able to spend on this. Some army comes in, you could just have little drones that go through, connect to the tanks, take them out. Go in, like go into the skin of the invading infantry. Now we can track them all, and if they start getting to be trouble, you press a button and it releases like something that knocks them out. Now that sounds crazy in science fiction, but if you had like 10 years to get ready for it, you don't think that that's technologically feasible? So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, that if you don't think that that would work, then I think you don't really believe how much richer a truly libertarian, peaceful society would be relative to the current one. The reason the modern state looks aggressive is because it's fighting other states. And so libertarian society would be nonviolent. Thank you.
Tom, for the negative.
I'm gonna
15
put
minutes.
a timepiece here.
Wow,
Well, you can see the 5 minutes.
But that means the first 10 minutes I'll have to somehow wing. I need a timepiece. All right, I've learned an awful lot from Bob Murphy over the years, and if there were anyone on earth who could persuade me on the subject of pacifism, it would be Bob. Bob is the sort of guy, whenever there's some objection to libertarianism that I can't come up with an answer for, some theoretical problem, whatever, and Walter Block is busy, I turn to Bob. Help me out of this. So, a lot of what Bob says I have no problem with, and I say that as somebody who, like most people in this room, I assume, would not describe himself as a pacifist. I think Bob makes legitimate points about the merits and even surprisingly the practicality of avoiding even defensive violence. I think to an extent he is pulling a bait and switch on this, and I'll get to that a little bit later. I believe he's promised us one thing and delivered us something quite lovely, but not quite what he promised. Now, if Bob is saying that the incentive structure in his ideal society, a Rothbardian society, will tend to minimize violence, I think we can have no objection to that. That's precisely one of the arguments we've made over the years. That's why we want a Rothbardian society. And I think there are reasons to believe that it would minimize violence, some of which are reasons Bob has mentioned. Violence is bad for business, but also private firms don't have the same kind of perceived legitimacy that a state does. Because you don't go through K through 12 education being told that it's right that Walmart is our sovereign. And Walmart is our sovereign through our consent that we granted at the time of the Declaration of Independence or whatever that, right? We're not taught that. We're taught that the state is our sovereign. We're not taught that about these private firms. So we would tend to look more askance at them if they tried to, let's say, wage a war or some preposterous thing like that. So I do believe that violence would be minimized in a Rothbardian society. And likewise, I think it's dumb to engage in violence. For example, if you're a libertarian, you're thinking that some violent solution might be the right approach. There's something wrong with you. You're deranged. You have a death wish of some kind. There's no way that could be a good idea practically, and I think even morally. I think that's a terrible idea. All right, so if we argue that a Rothbardian society minimizes violence, that's one thing, but that's an insight we've had for a while, and I don't think we need to draw on pacifism to uphold that. So if we're going to argue that pacifism is a plausible organizing principle for a society, and is in fact morally superior to one in which defensive violence is permitted, I'm going to need to hear a little bit more meat, and perhaps Bob's got it, so we'll see. But I see no preferable method for determining what we mean by pacifism, apart from consulting the dictionary, because that gives us the standard definition that is accepted by the public. So I went to Merriam-Webster, and by the way, I hate when a public speaker says, well, the dictionary says marriage is between, Silly dictionary, it's such a crutch that speakers use, but in this case, it really helps me out. So the definitions in Merriam-Webster for pacifism are, number one, opposition to war or violence as a means of settling disputes. Number two, an attitude or policy of non-resistance. All right, well, if non-resistance is what is expected of us, to the point that a society is morally superior to another one if it's based on non-resistance, again, I'm going to need to be persuaded of that, and I want to raise some considerations that I think are in the back of everybody's minds here, and I want to get them out on the table. It's not that Bob can't handle them, but they need to be out on the table. Now, first of all, I think we're being very indulgent toward Bob here, because he's adopted what he would surely admit is an idiosyncratic definition of pacifism, because his version distinguishes between force and violence, which strikes me as the kind of distinction that, I don't know, Bill Clinton might have made. I mean, dictionaries give us the standard, widely accepted definitions of words, and I don't believe Bob's understanding conforms to that standard. Now, if he wants to argue a different standard, that's fine, we'll do that. But then he should say so, he should tell us so. Because Bob's model does involve the physical restraint of evildoers. That is not a philosophy of non-resistance. So I believe that counts against him in assessing the resolution. Also, it seems to me there is a moral confusion at the heart of pacifism. It seems as if we're being told that confining an innocent child and confining a serial rapist are really the same thing, because they both involve confinement, as if it's the confinement per se, rather than the moral status of the parties that should concern us. Likewise, the idea that violence itself must be immoral, regardless of the circumstances, such that punching and restraining a serial rapist is separated perhaps only by degrees from punching and restraining a small child, seems to contradict every moral instinct we have. Now, here's the example that Bob is waiting for me to bring up. If a brutal killer is behaving in a violent way toward a victim, is it morally wrong to stop this evil? Is the repulsion of evil the same thing as initiating it, or at least close enough that both are to be condemned? Is extinguishing a fire the same thing as setting one? No society can prevent all crime, and we've never claimed that a stateless society could. There will be violence perpetrated against innocents from now until the end of time. The question is how we deal with it. Now, some pacifists have tried to build an escape hatch for themselves. And they say, well, we can't defend ourselves, but we may defend other people. And that's not going to work. There's a philosopher, Jan Narveson, who dealt with this a long time ago, because he said, there's no moral distinction between you and a someone else. And to someone else, you're a someone else. Everybody's basically a someone else. So there's no moral distinction between you and someone else that would entitle you to defend one and not the other. But what really seems to be at the heart of this moral confusion is the idea that violence is wrong, but so is resisting. I don't get how both of those are possible. Now, Bob is generous enough to allow us that we have the right to use defensive violence, and I appreciate that kind concession, because it would render the idea of rights nugatory and absurd. Because the idea of a right is that you have a moral claim to repel an aggressor against your rights. Now, Bob has raised in the past the example that I'm about to give you. The example of, let's say one of your children is being disemboweled in front of you. The question becomes, can I resist this? And so Bob himself was asked this question, and he gave the answer that in that situation he probably would use violence. Now you may say, Woods, you got him, if he admits that. But Bob's a clever one, and he has a escape hatch for that. I'm a pacifist who, in the last resort, would use violence, but I'm still a pacifist. He's got an answer for that. His answer is, suppose you're a vegetarian and somebody's disemboweling your child, and we say, all right, either you eat a ham sandwich or we disembowel your child, and you eat the ham sandwich. We don't say, aha, you're not a real vegetarian. And so Bob likewise is saying, look, you can't say I'm not a real pacifist just because I would use violence in the last resort. But the problem here is that's the very principle in question. Using violence to prevent a violent assault is the principle we're debating. And if we use Bob's escape hatch, that would mean nobody anywhere has any principles, because we would all throw them out the window to prevent our children from being disemboweled. So and moreover, think about let's go through my life. I've had a pretty peaceful, ironic life. Okay? I haven't used violence a whole lot. And if you take a look at me, I think you can understand why. I bet if you examined the lives of Bob Murphy and Tom Woods, you would find that the use of violence in each case has been extremely limited. Almost never in my life have I resorted to violence. The last such occurrence took place when I was 12. And this is true of virtually all non-pacifists like me. We go through our lives never needing to use defensive violence. Now, in a pinch, with no other option, we would use defensive violence. But apparently this is also Bob's position. He too says that in a pinch he would use defensive violence, but this shouldn't make us doubt his pacifism. But the trouble Bob faces here is that by this definition, namely that a pacifist who opposes the use of violence, but who can use it as a last resort without forfeiting his status as a pacifist, then virtually all of mankind could be considered pacifist. Because that's how all of us are. We don't all go around every day thinking, oh, I'm itching to pick a fight with somebody. Or there's some loudmouth in the dining hall, I think I'm gonna go kick him in the teeth. We don't act that way. We act practically as pacifists all the time. But then the concept ceases to be interesting if we all qualify as pacifists. And it seems to me that by Bob's definition, we do. If Bob is so special that he urges us to use a particular word, I can't see that, okay, namely pacifist, to describe him, then his views better be pretty darn distinctive. But if he says that in the last resort, he too can resort to defensive violence while still calling himself a pacifist, I think that's really too much. Seems to me I would be called a pacifist also. So what's the difference between Bob and me? What's the difference? I wouldn't use defensive violence either, except in an extreme last resort. How are we different? I guess the difference is Bob sits on a platonic mountaintop dreaming of a world without defensive violence. But in practice, he's exactly like me. Now, if my child is being assaulted, and I'm repelling the assault, I genuinely am curious what Bob's position would be. Now, he says he's not here to render moral judgments. But if in the back of his mind he's thinking, well, a really moral person would allow, would refuse to use defensive violence, I don't see how Bob's not morally judging me. I don't understand why he wouldn't be if he believes that it's morally superior to allow that to go on unimpeded. Now, I'm going to tell you a story. See if this rings true to you. In junior high, there was a nerdy kid named Ben, and he was made fun of and attacked all the time. And he was a terrible nerd because he looked like a nerd, but he didn't have the smarts of a nerd, so he had none of the benefits and all of that. There was another kid named Brian who gave him a hard time every day, sometimes physically, sometimes just abused him. And I was kind of friends with Brian, even though he was a jerk, and I didn't really like Ben. And one day we got the news, something just happened outside of the playground. Ben had flattened him. We didn't know he had it in him. And we all cheered. Like, we liked Brian, but screw him. Good for Ben. Ben flattened him, and Brian never bothered him again. I don't see that it's morally superior for Ben to just sit there and basically be a punching bag. That is, in fact, those were the options. It was either that, or he lets Brian know, stay away from me. And it stuck. Now look, Bob Murphy's a very fine person. He's got many clever arguments. Chances are you voted against the resolution like me. And you're going to be tempted to change your vote because you hear Bob's clever arguments and you think, well, Bob deserves my vote because he made me think, and maybe his ideas aren't as destructive of civilization as I thought. And you're also being pushed in the direction of voting for the resolution by thinking, doggone it, isn't it about time Bob Murphy won a debate for a change? Why should Woods win all the time, you know? Let's give this to Bob as some kind of an honorary recognition of his contributions to the liberty movement. I mean, and speaking of which, while we're at it, maybe Bob could be recognized with a Lifetime Achievement Award at the Austrian Economics Center in Vienna this year. Oh wait, that's me winning that award, I'm sorry. I'm getting that award. That's not. Now, I understand and sympathize with these humane instincts of yours, dear audience, but we must not let these cloud our judgment, because that's not what this debate is about. To vote for the resolution, you have to understand that you are voting for a principle that the moment it becomes seriously challenging for the person advocating it, that person abandons it instantly. What can we really say about such a principle? And I'll close with an incident from my own history, and you tell me which side of this rings true to you as being the side of justice. 6 years old, I had a big wheel. The big wheel has a removable plastic seat. and there was a little witch in my neighborhood. She was a couple years older than I was, and she stole everybody's stuff all the time. And she had this witch cackle as she was stealing. So she stole my big wheel, and she's riding away cackling. She's got my big wheel, and I finally thought, this ends today. I chased her, I caught up to her, I pulled out that removable seat, and I smashed that little bitch over the head. Now, if you're a normal person like me, that is the very epitome of justice. If you're Bob, you think the witch suffered an injustice. If you're for witches, side with Bob. And if you're for justice, side
Course correction. Is that seat taken over here, up there? That seat there? So, Jana, could you sit there?
because of my eyesight.
Yeah, no, indeed, and of course at the Soul Forum, we have these things covered. The guy really is sending up signs that right in front of the debater. We screwed up this time, but we made a correction about that. Okay, and now it's 5 minutes of rebuttal from Bob. Bob, take it away.
Can someone get us water, please?
I will.
Thank you.
Another screw up.
Okay, here
sorry.
we go.
We provide water.
Okay, so let me, first of all, deal with this issue of the bait and switch. Apparently we're debating different things. Tom seems to be debating whether you yourself in life right now should be a pacifist. And that's a very interesting debate, but that's not the one we're having right now. Again, it's saying a society that's pacifist is morally and practically superior to one using defensive violence. And Tom didn't really talk about any of that. So I think perhaps, he's conceding, until he challenges it, it seems that he's conceding the basic framework I laid out, right? The acknowledging, we talked about, the incentives and so forth. And yeah, we all concede that stuff, but we already knew that. Well, let's make sure we understand what he was conceding that we already knew. I'm saying that, bank robbers come in and the vaults close and the doors come down and, they get trapped perhaps and the police show up and they don't have guns. And they just have body armor on, and they take them down without using violence. All right. And again, I'm saying not because there's this great pacifist awakening throughout society, thanks, but because just thinking through the incentives of it, just like at your grocery store, someone's stealing a bunch of steaks and going for the door. If the security guy came out and shot the guy in the head, and blood just splattered all over the place, people would be horrified. Right, that would be bad for business. And so if it were just grocery stores hiring private security firms that were competing with each other, that's one of the selling points. So if that happened once, that security firm would go out of business. Not because they violated the NAP, right? No, the guy was a thief. He had it coming. They were using violence to protect their property rights, but because that's just bad for business. Customers don't want to see blood get splattered. So I'm saying in a libertarian world that would be, people would be 20 times as wealthy per capita as they are in our world right now very quickly if we got rid of the parasitical state. All right, crime, the motives for break-ins and rapists and all that stuff. Just think about how horribly that's amped up right now with our so-called criminal justice system that the state runs. Okay, so it's true, besides the drug war and the educational, horrible educational system and the minimum wage and all these things that, quote, contribute to crime, I also think the idea that we're going to take people and put them in cages with other criminals, and that's the way we're going to try to minimize crime over the long run, that's crazy. All right, so I think clearly in a libertarian world of the type we know, the way you deal with basic crime prevention, it would quickly switch to nonviolent apprehension of criminals. So there's still laws, but there's still property rights. People know who are the aggressors and who aren't, who the criminals are and who aren't. Just like, Gandhi knew that, just like Jesus in his ministry, he wasn't saying, hey, anything goes. That's obviously not what he was saying, okay? That's not what the Sermon on the Mount was all about. So the point being, there are rules, and I'm arguing a society that followed a nonviolent way of dealing with bad people would be much preferable, and I think both morally and practically, to one that doesn't, all right? And so Tom, he was, again, to the extent that he talked about any of that at all, it sounded like he was stickling. Now maybe he's going to come back and clarify, but he didn't really talk much about that. Okay, also he was talking about there being a moral confusion here in looking at the dictionary definition. So clearly I am talking about nonviolent resistance. All right, and if Tom wants to say, well, no, that's not what we meant by pacifism, well, okay, but I think clearly there's a huge scope for most libertarians, if you ask them, hey, what if you get invaded by a neighboring state and it sends its armies and bombers in? they're not going to say what I just said in my opening statement. Oh, the way you could deal with that non-violently would be things like, oh, you could have thousands of little airborne drones that would go through and like attach to the tanks and then take out the treads and inject something in the people so you could track them and knock them out and so forth. That's not what they're talking about. They're going to say, oh, we're going to, if you read Hoppe or Rothbard or anybody, or even Murphy back when I wrote Chaos Theory, we were using violent methods. We were just saying private competing organizations would provide better military defense. And so I believe that. Now, the last thing I'll say here is it's true that there would be an intermediate period. Okay, so we got this libertarian society, let's say, it's like 10 million people. And I think if we ran the numbers, we could show if they could just remain fine for a decade, they would be so rich they could repel any invasion the way I described. They would be physically removed. Armies marched in, they would be physically removed. Hoppe would approve. Okay, and that would be fine. But there would be an intermediate period where, like, if the US or the UK government wanted to bomb the heck out of them, they couldn't repel them. They'd be too strong. And so it's precisely for those people, we should be nonviolent. We shouldn't be stockpiling weapons, even if they're defensive, because that would give the outsiders a pretext to invade us. We would have to be like we currently are as libertarians vis-a-vis the federal government. And Tom agrees, we wouldn't take up arms against them. That's crazy. Okay? So Tom's a tough guy. He'll punch a little girl, but he won't actually stand up. So yes, if you want to vote for what we're doing right now, endorsing it, vote with me. If you want to beat up little girls, vote with Tom. Thank you.
Expansive definition of what constitutes society than Bob does, because Bob thinks if I'm not talking about private defense agencies, then I'm not talking about society. But I think of all the interactions we have with other human beings as constituting the nexus of society. And I will concede to Bob, out of my generosity, I will concede to Bob that I think the way Bob theorizes about how a defense agency would operate under certain institutional constraints is original. And that's why, as I say, Bob's kind of my go-to guy when I'm stumped. I think that is some original analysis. I still believe, though, that we ought to be. The key question to me in this is the question that is on the minds of everybody, which is it really a matter of moral superiority that we're talking about here? Because the case I gave, which Bob doesn't want to touch with a 10-foot pole, of an actual situation involving a direct threat to someone in your home. Now that's part of society. Your home is part of society. Criminals are part of society. They come in and they attack you. Now there are ways, it's true, there are nonviolent ways you could handle situations like that. Sometimes. Other times there really is no such choice. And you would have to repel people with violence. Now, if I were Bob, I would want to stick to my theories about how I would handle an invader with some drones, and I'd put something in the neck and whatever, because that is very clever, and maybe that would work. I would not want to deal with the individual case of the individuals who live in that society, because I think it does not ring true at a fundamental level. In the way we theorize about what's moral and what's not, what's acceptable and what's not, what's demanded of us and what's not, it does not ring true. The position of absolute non-resistance. Non-resistance is the word that is in the dictionary definition of pacifism. Non-resistance. So if Bob's going to give the example of Gandhi, that's all well and good. But if we're talking about society in general, was Gandhi proposing that his nonviolent approach to the British was how you should approach all criminals in Indian society? That they should all just be met with nonviolence? I don't think so. And to extrapolate from that to society in general, I think is a category mistake. These are two different situations. So I won't end with any cheap shots about Bob and punching girls and all that. I will say I got that out of my system when I was 6. Felt great. I've never felt the need to resort to that again. But in a way, the fact that I had to do it only once and I never had to resort to it again more or less proves my point.
Okay, we now move to the next phase of the debate, and that's sort of a threefold right on the part of the moderator, me, takes moderator's prerogative to ask questions of either debater, on the part of each debater to ask questions of the other, and at any time. And you're right to ask questions of the debaters, and that's going to be 30 minutes. I just want to begin with moderator's prerogative and ask Bob this question. Bob, you have the mic. Yeah. So you were sort of talking about, if I understand you correctly, the nonviolence of the stun gun, meaning then that you don't permanently impair somebody, you just put them out of commission for a given period of time so that you can flee or at least do whatever else to get rid of them. And that's your definition of pacifism. Do I have you correctly in that sense?
I'll try to be real brief here, so I don't know if you're gonna follow. So yeah.
Take all the time you need.
Oh, okay. I don't know if you're just setting me up to ask the true question. So yeah, what I'm doing right here is there's a whole spectrum of it. Okay, and so clearly a pacifist cannot be using violence, and so the line I'm drawing is to say you can't cause physical harm or injury to somebody else. Okay, so you could take it even further. And I'm a Christian, so obviously this is being informed by my Christian background. I think really, even if you were a pacifist, like you didn't use violence, but you just walked around swearing at people and calling them, castigating things against their mother, and you were just mocking them and spreading gossip, well, that would be bad too, right? So you can take it even further and say, no, really, if you really wanted to live up to it, what you should do is love your enemy. Okay, so it's not just refraining from punching them, but I can't do it, but to meet them with love and compassion. That's the ultimate level, and so I'm saying there's different levels here, and right now, just for the purposes of this debate, yeah, I'm gonna say clearly non-violence, and I can make the argument there. I do think if we took it further, like the kind of thing Tom's talking about, that would work as well. But yes, what I'm making the case for right here is if we just refrain from harming other people, period, not just initiators, but refrain from harming them no matter what, it would not spell disaster. And in fact, when we saw it work, we'd say, hey, isn't that a classier way? Isn't this a good example for the world?
But I'm saying, Bob, you're saying that not harming can involve, you don't harm somebody when you shoot them with a stun gun, you put them out of commission for a given period of time. You're saying that that's part of your definitional rule of not harming somebody. If I put a stun gun to you right now and put you out of commission for a couple of hours, you came to, you're still the same Bob, that's not harming.
I wouldn't want to cause pain. So my understanding of how stun guns work is that would not be.
Just metaphorically, you said something on the skin, of people.
We would knock them out. Yeah.
Knock them out.
Yeah.
Okay. The knockout. The knockout is not harming as long as they come to in a couple of hours.
Right. Yeah. There's no long-term physical damage. They wake up. They've been physically taken out of the society.
So that's part of your baseline definition of pacifism in your society. And indeed, obviously, do you want to comment on that question, Tom, or do you want to waive it? Yeah, all right. And then also, Tom, Bob, at this moment, do either of you want to take prerogative to ask the other a question, or do you want to give it to audience questions?
Sure.
Yeah, Tom wants to ask a question.
Should I ask him first?
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, so I'll ask one. Okay, so Tom, this is a horrific situation. You're out with your daughters, and this guy comes up and he pulls a gun, and he's clearly going to shoot your daughter. And there's another bystander there, and he has a gun, and it's crystal clear he's not giving you permission to grab his gun away from him and use it to defend your daughter. Are you, if there's no other thing you can think of to do, are you going to grab that other guy's gun away from him against his consent and use it to defend your daughter from being shot?
Can I have the mic?
Oh, yeah.
Actually, Gene, do you?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
This mic works?
Yeah, so, yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Are you saying that if I were to do that, I'm gonna answer your question first with a question, then with an answer. You saying that if I were to do that therefore I don't believe in property rights?
I'm going to say Nick Sarwark is right. You're not a libertarian. You should stop calling yourself that. Words have meaning. It's crystal clear what the definition of libertarianism. You don't endorse the initiation of aggression. You would be stealing from that guy because you really needed to. What an awful situation.
In that particular case, I would throw myself on the mercy of my peers, and I would say, yes, I did do something wrong, but I'm going to throw myself on the mercy of my peers and hope that I get that my situation is somehow mitigated in the eyes of people.
Okay, so if there were a debate that said a society respecting the non-aggression principle is morally and practically superior, the one that violates the non-aggression principle, you would be for the negative. You disagree that society...
So, this is the thing. So It's true, okay, so in a case like that, if it's a case of, like my family's starving and there's food over there, this is the question that's thrown at libertarians all the time. In that case, I've generally said that you do what you have to do to save your family. So I know you're gonna say, well, that's all I'm doing. I'm just using violence to save my family, right?
Right.
But see, that's the whole thing. I mean, like you wanna use a different word to distinguish you from everyone else.
Okay, so you're
It's something
saying,
everyone would do.
so Tom respects property rights unless it's very inconvenient, and then he violates them. Paul Krugman has all sorts of, he doesn't violate property rights willy-nilly, he has good reasons. There's climate change, there's inequality, there's all sorts of reasons for violence, so you're not a libertarian. That's, everybody who violates property rights does it for a reason. It's not because they just don't believe in property, except for like small ones. So, again, I think you should stop calling yourself a
All
libertarian.
right, well then let me.
I'm done, Gene.
Let me transition to my question.
He's gonna ask you a question.
Let me transition to my question.
All right.
This works,
I
so-
understand
this
that-
works, yeah.
I genuinely don't understand the difference between you and me on this. I don't understand what the difference could possibly be. Because on the one hand, you want to use a word that has great moral purchase for many people.
Mhm.
The idea of pacifism. Because people know there are a lot of people in history who have been morally admirable, who have advocated pacifism. So you get to bask in that great moral glory.
Mhm.
But at the same time, what you're saying to me though is that in the last resort, yeah, you would probably betray it. But my point is, it's not like the difference between you and me is I go around with my gun in my holster and I'm flipping it around and just irrationally firing it at people all day. It never even occurs to me to use violence, and I'm going on, I guess, 34 years violence-free. Okay, 34 years
Ever
violence-free.
since you smacked that girl.
But the point is that I've gone all this time without using violence. It never even occurs to me to use it. In a last resort, I would use it. How is that different from your position? And if it's not, why am I not a pacifist?
Okay, so I think part of it is, and again, I don't know what your views are, but a lot of people who talk these, they're going to say, well, it's because I'm relying on the violence of others. So the reason I tend to go through my day-to-day life without having to punch people is because there's the police, the court system, and the military protecting our freedom, right? That's the thing. So I know you don't endorse like U.S. foreign policy, but so if that's part of your framework, if you think in a libertarian world that yes, there have to be these institutions that they show up, and the pros show up to use violence, so normal people tend not to have to, that would be one major difference. That I would not use my money to support businesses that had violence, or at least that was an option. If one business said we don't use violence, even against shoplifters, I would try to go to them. So if that's partly where you're coming from, that's one thing. But the other one is, yeah, when I say, like, if someone's gonna do something, I'm not gonna sit there and watch someone hurt my son. But what I mean is, I think a lot of people mean, oh, I would, grab this pen and jam it in the guy's eye. I would really, I think a lot of these things are contrived in most cases, but no, like, I would get in front of the guy, or I would try to, tackle him or whatever. So really, a lot of what I'm saying is just ending the situation, and yeah, if there was no other option, I'm not gonna sit there and watch that happen. But I think that's far removed from most normal people, is they would say, like Rothbard said, yeah, a guy's coming at me with a knife and I got a gun, I'd plug him, all right? And so that's, I think there's a huge chasm between what I'm talking about. And yeah, and I would think of that for the rest of my life. If I did have to hurt someone long-term to diffuse that situation, I would think, how could I have done that? The analogy is, like, if you hurt your brother and then had to go tell your parents, and because he was drunk and came at me with a knife and I had it, but you would be regretting that forever. So that's something I'd look at this as a human being, and geez, if
Yeah, I thank you, Bob. I want to now give it over to, if you have a response, Tom, maybe save it for a question. I think the young lady over there had a question, and I believe, do we need a mic for that? I think we should use a mic. Yes? Okay, so Jenna, would you maybe grab Tom's mic, and then they'll just have to share? And then, of course, the usual thing I say is please phrase your question as though it's a question. And then if it's addressed to either of the two, then mention who it's addressed to. Go ahead.
Okay, so one of the things that I'm curious about is maybe I am missing something, because it seems to me is the distinction that you're making, Bob, and that Bob's not able to see is, it seems he's conceding that he can envision a new world where there are defensive mechanisms against invading states and so on. But if we're prosperous, is the distinction that you're saying well, maybe I have like this spiky neck now that I could actually prevent someone from disemboweling my daughter because I'm so rich as part of this rich society. And so is that the distinction that makes your position more tenable and makes you different than what he's saying, that you're just gonna resort to violence in
Right, so that's a great point, that I think these sort of contrived situations where they're gonna say, you either adhere to this principle you just enunciated, or your kid dies in front of your face, and which, as we've seen, Tom's not a libertarian if that's the standard we're gonna use, and yet he still calls himself a libertarian. And again, he can't say, well, that's the whole thing under dispute. Right, under libertarian rights here, the reason people are status is because they think there's a lot of important things that wouldn't happen if you obeyed libertarianism, and it makes it hard, and that's why not most people are libertarian. So likewise here, but you're right, I think you're not gonna see all these crazy situations, that it's gonna be less in the kind of society I'm talking about. We take it as a baseline of how much violence is out there and how vulnerable we are to it, but in a world that obeyed the kind of things I'm laying out here, this chance of you being in a situation where you had no choice but to rip some guy's eye out before he disemboweled, that's not gonna happen. That's just like you'd say, what if you had to torture someone for hours in order to prevent something? In general, I'm fine saying I'm against the use of torture, period, and you can come up with crazy scenarios that make me look bad, but I'm fine saying I'm against torture, and I'm fine saying I'm against using violence against other people in the practical world. So the more people who did that, the less even apparent need for violence there would be.
Okay, I'd like to ask Bob a question then. And the more you clarify your position, the more likely you are to win. But I want you to clarify your position because I'd rather learn about this than
Tom's gonna vote for me at the end.
Yeah, that's right. How do you feel about the use of, let's say, brandishing a gun in a threatening way, defensively, even if, like, let's say in your heart of hearts you don't actually ever intend to pull the trigger? Is that acceptable?
Okay, so again, what I don't so much want this to be about how am I living my life here, because that's not really the debate.
I don't know, if we're living in your
right,
society,
so no,
what would be considered
right,
acceptable?
and that would be, to go to your question, another way of distinguishing us. Right, I decided a while ago I'm not going to carry a gun. So yes, I would say that people, if they're living in a world that renounces the use of violence, then yeah, they're not going to be walking around with guns, unless it's like to deal with, wolves or something. But yeah, they're not going to be using things that could be used to harm other people. That would not, a society that did that would not be following what I'm talking about in the resolution.
Okay, so I want to know, in that society, in a libertarian society, I don't know the extent to which they've become Bob Murphy people, but somebody, there's a huge number of cases of home invasions where the invader is repelled without being shot, but with the homeowner simply brandishing the weapon. Now, if the weapon can't even be brandished, I think people ought to know that. If that's going to be your view, that in that society we would frown upon people brandishing a gun at an intruder.
Okay, and again, here though, I want to clarify, I'm not up here saying, hey, you know what, if you have a gun in your house, get rid of it. That's not what I'm saying.
I get it.
I'm talking about this society, and I'm saying if everybody in it did not brandish a gun and just, they had safe rooms, they had surveillance gated communities, there wouldn't be many criminals in the first place because the state causes so much crime, blah, blah, blah. That I'm saying they wouldn't be sitting ducks, there wouldn't be an unacceptably high amount of home invasions that aren't repelled and so forth. So yes, if that clarifies for people, but I'm not wagging my finger saying you're a bad person right now if you have a gun.
I get it, but the resolution uses the language morally superior, so there is a bit of a wagging of a finger in there.
You said you think brandishing the gun is probably better if that's enough to get the person to leave than not, right? Most people would agree. Yeah, if you didn't have to shoot the guy.
Sure.
So you're wagging the finger too. So I'm saying it's the same thing. That the sense that if someone breaks in and some lady shoots some 200-pound guy that's drunk coming in there, you wouldn't say, "Oh, I think she's immoral." You'd probably get her on your podcast, right? And so the author turned to be the girl he hit when she was 6. But
Guys, I want to give more opportunities.
Sorry, okay.
Janet, grab Tom's thing, and then we have a number, 3, 4 questions. You'll all get a chance to ask your questions.
Yeah, my question is for Bob. Using a drone to knock someone out, or a stun gun, or tackling the guy who's about to assault your kid, these are methods of defensive violence. So I don't understand your definition.
okay, so this is going back what Tom said, where he thinks I'm being, quibbling over distinction.
That literally is defensive violence. That's the whole point. The point is to use violence to stop an attack. And stun guns that knock a guy out and tackling the guy, that's violence. That's what that is. Just because it's not lethal doesn't mean it's not violence.
Okay, so if you go in for surgery and the doctor puts you under, would you say the doctor used consensual violence against you?
I consented to that, as an aggressor certainly would not have.
Right, so I'm saying the word violence, it does not have, look, do boxers use violence against each other?
No, again, that's part of the
Whoa,
game.
whoa, whoa, hang on. No, it means I'm not quibbling here. Professional
Well, do they use
boxers in a
violence?
fight,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
they consented to that, right?
Yeah.
So you're wrong for thinking that the definition of violence has consent built in. It doesn't. Violence is causing physical injury to somebody else.
Right, well, knocking a guy out is causing him some injury, right? He was walking along wanting to aggress, and you came along and knocked
Okay,
him
well,
out.
I'm using it in the sense of not causing long-term damage.
Yeah, we've got, if you want to comment, Tom, you want to?
No, I'll let that
Okay,
stand.
okay. Oops.
Question for Tom, on the second definition of pacifism. It seems that Bob believes that what Gandhi did, what Martin Luther King did. Another example I can think of is Quakers that were abolitionists on the Underground Railroad. So they weren't using violence, but they were definitely resisting. And you use the second definition. Do you think that you can be a pacifist while still being resistant, or is that abrogated by the definition?
Well, I think you can I think you can, but the issue that I was the distinction I was trying to make was, how many people did Gandhi tackle, and how many people did Gandhi confine in a net, or how many people did Gandhi target with drones? So my point is that if you're going to use Gandhi as an example, well, okay, there's great moral force associated with Gandhi, so everybody wants to use him. But it's not an example for how to run a society. It's an example of how to run a resistance movement. But that's not even how Bob thinks we ought to deal with criminals, is pure non-resistance. So I think that non-resistance word is quite a hurdle to overcome. That's why I'm glad I'm on my side of the resolution.
Do you want to comment, Bob? No? Yeah, okay. Next question, yeah.
Hello. All right. So this question is for Bob, but I want to make a little point. But Ayn Rand said that a society is just a collection of individuals, and that the smallest minority is the individual. And if we're talking about the resolution of a society as morally superior to not use, to be pacifist, well, I come from the society of California, where they're just allowing, basically, the government's being pacifist about allowing crime to happen. The week before I came on this cruise, my family's company, we are contractors, and we had someone break into our warehouse, steal a truck and thousands of dollars worth of tools, and drove the truck through our warehouse door. And when we making a police report, the cops were just saying, "You guys even want to make a police report? We're likely not going to find them," and they just kind of sort of shrugged their shoulders. That, to me, is, I'm living in my own home state where I want to flee a society that is just being pacifist about criminals doing what they want to do.
So if you don't pay your taxes, they're not going to do anything to you? If you don't pay your California state income taxes, they're not going to do anything?
Oh, they're going to do something.
Okay, so they're not pacifist towards criminals. They just run the justice system horribly and efficiently. There's all sorts of coercion.
They're being very selective on who they're enforcing the law against. If someone, if I'm get drunk at a bar with my friends and I go out and I take a piss out in public, and I'm in my home city, which is a relatively nice city, I'll get take arrested for indecent exposure. But in San Francisco and Los Angeles, I clean up trash for a living half the day, and we 2 weeks before I came here, we were having to do a cleanup of a big homeless encampment that has syringes and feces on the sidewalks. If you're going to selectively enforce the law, that's being sort of pacifist to the lower class of society or whatever. That is being pacifist to allow people to break the law.
Okay, so all those things you're talking about, I think, are exacerbated by the state policies. I could with just as much force say, on that one issue, they're being very libertarian. They're not, it's not police
Now-
using tax
now-
dollars
now
to enforce the
before-
law, so therefore that's a strike against libertarianism, and that would be silly.
Now, when they're tagging people's private property and destroying, they're allowing people to camp out on people's property. It's not, this isn't just like.
No, but listen though, but even the types of things I'm talking about, like private agencies that would come in and defend your property, albeit in a nonviolent fashion, that's illegal. The California, the police at your local level wouldn't allow that to happen. So you're looking at a violent state, an institution based on violence, causing things to be bad, and then you're saying that discredits pacifism. I say, no, that just shows you violence doesn't work. Here's yet another example.
Next question, yeah, and then you.
Hey fellas, question for both of you. How do you deal with the very subjective line of when it's going to be appropriate to either use defensive violence or use pacifist resistance? Because there was a little bit of confusion, I think, in some of the talking earlier, where you were trying to almost make some distinctions between somebody who was doing very minor crime versus somebody who was like trying to disembowel your children or something like that. You know what I mean? So where is that? It's a very subjective line in terms of how the individual is going to view somebody aggressing against them. And
Okay, yeah, Tom.
Yeah, all right. Well, the thing is, there is no one principle that I could come up. I mean, because in a case like this, I think this would be a situation where you would have to have your peers examine the facts of the matter and decide if you behaved the way a reasonable person in the same situation would. And by the way, I think that is a general principle of, because a lot of times there are situations that we've never seen before, that we've never seen these exact particulars. So it's up to your peers to decide how would a reasonable person have behaved in the same situation. So, what would that standard of reasonability be? Well, I mean, as you say, it's subjective. From my point of view, in terms of using really severe physical force, it would have to be something that involves the direct safety of my family or friends or companions. It would have to be that. If it's just, if somebody is, running off with $50, I don't think I'm going to shoot the guy in the head. And I'm not exactly sure how I would handle that situation. But to me, especially given how not prone to violence I am, especially because I know that the violence is not going to come out in my favor, so I generally, for strategic reasons, practical reasons, I avoid it. I can only imagine it being in a case like that. I mean, in the kind of case that would make even Bob say, okay, this doesn't make me any less of a pacifist, but in this particular bizarre case that is extremely unlikely to happen, I would have to do something.
You want to come in, Bob?
Yeah, so like maybe one way of looking at it, right? I think everybody in this room realizes that, okay, yeah, if some of your neighbors telling you a story, like, yeah, I came downstairs and the teenager from next door was in my kitchen rummaging through the fridge, and he violated my property rights, so I took a stake and I got him and stabbed him in the eye. You'd be like, whoa, you did what? And technically that's consistent with the NAP. He violated my property rights, and so I can hit that, And I think most of us would be horrified by that. And so I'm just saying the sense in which if somebody said, it would be morally and practically superior if you would handle that in a way that, yeah, you didn't give away all the stuff in your fridge, but you also got him out of there without really hurting that teenage kid. I'm saying the same thing, just at a grander scale, and I think a lot of just the quick rejection, like, oh, that wouldn't work. It's the same kind of thing when you tell someone we could have a society that doesn't have taxation, and most people say, oh, give me that would, we're so naive. It's very similar, the arguments that I get on this stuff, so it doesn't mean I'm right, but for libertarians of all people, I think you should realize that I'm just saying it's not as stupid, that the case for violence is much weaker than is conventionally thought.
I think we see questions in the back.
So, when Martin Luther King had death threats made against him and his family, he applied for a license to carry a firearm and was denied. The threat was made and inevitably was carried out. He was murdered. he had the intent to use violence to defend himself and his family, and the state refused him that license. Also with Jesus, he advocated for peace and told his followers, don't cut the ear off the high priest. But when he was confronted with money changers in his father's house, he fashioned a whip, he beat them, he overturned their tables, and he chased them out.
Could you pose your question? Yeah.
Does that make one, both, or neither of them pacifists? The fact that Jesus was proposing peace, yet used violence in defense of his father's house, and Martin Luther King did not use violence, but was obviously prepared and was looking for permission from the state. So which one of them were not pacifists?
I guess that's a question for you, Bob.
Okay, yeah, I don't really know about the Martin Luther King and the gun thing. I'll assume that that's correct. Okay, great. Tom says yes. So it's on there, and that's the danger with pointing to real world people because they're flawed and whatever. And so yeah, and I know there's other problems with Martin Luther King in terms of his personal life. So I'm just saying, in terms of the strategic use of nonviolent resistance for political change, that was something he clearly thought through. He read Tolstoy and stuff like that, and that's where he got that. So that was me citing him. So yeah, if he did that, then he's not a pacifist in my book. As far as Jesus, again, this goes back to Adam's example. Again, there I would say, I guess we'd have to see literally what happened. Did the money changers, did they have welts on their back afterward, or was it just more he physically removed them? And yeah, he had a, so again, I'm not sure, but I don't think that 10 years later they could show the scars from when Jesus whipped them, is my guess. But, so that's what I would say is there, he used force but not violence. And that's the one time we have of him doing something like that.
Oh,
Can I just
okay,
have a quick-
sure, okay.
I think this would be a whole separate matter to talk about, was Christ a pacifist? Because I know Bob believes he was. I mean, you can make arguments on both sides of that. He does say, if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. I don't think Bob would say that, so I think that is a difference. The Roman centurion is not rebuked by Christ. He has ample opportunity to rebuke him, does not. A group of soldiers ask Christ, what should we do? He doesn't say resign your commission. He doesn't say stop committing violence. He says don't extort money and don't accuse people falsely. Okay, well that's a pretty substantial omission. I mean, there's your opportunity to tell the whole world how you feel. So I don't think that's a home run by any means.
Okay, we have time for two more questions.
Can I say one-
Are we really that low on time? Holy moly.
Well, it's time for
Let me just be, real fast.
But listen, you're 7 minutes summary.
Yeah.
Knock him out, stun him.
I don't. I don't. So obviously, I'm a Christian, and I think the Sermon on the Mount stuff at face value sounds pacifist. But I'm not here saying if you disagree with me on that, you're a bad Christian. That's not what I'm saying. It's open on that one thing. But the same token, when the tax collector said to Jesus, "What should I do?" He said, just to be fair with people, don't overcharge them. And so again, I don't think therefore, we better stop saying taxation stuff because Jesus had the opportunity to say don't tax me. So again, the way you would handle that, that's how I would handle the thing with, telling the soldiers this is the way to be an upstanding citizen given your moral framework.
The Orthodox Jews in the audience can ignore all that. In the back. We have time for two more questions.
Sometimes I feel like you're sort of talking past each other, so I'm
Talking
going to
past each other.
try and paraphrase and see if I've got this correct. It seems, Bob, you said that yes, as a society we would have to stockpile weapons until such time as we're rich enough to not need them. So yeah.
Can you say that again?
You said it's okay to stockpile, and if we were to turn into a libertarian society, before we get the magic drones and the things that attack tanks magically, we may still have to defend ourselves against some overwhelming power. Remember saying that? Is that?
I think you misunderstood what I said, but go ahead and I'll
So it seems to me there's two situations, and then there is all the situation of somebody is disemboweling my child in front of me. So it's like two separate, where either I am the person who is so much strength, I have these magical drones. I don't even need to defend myself because I can just subdue you. And on the other hand, this is a last resort. I have overwhelming force being confronted with this, so I have to do this last-ditch effort. These seem like these two extreme scenarios. Either I'm so powerful I can just magically sedate people, or I'm so weak because I can't sedate people, I have to resort to this force. Is that, and it seems like most of the situations we actually live in are in the middle somewhere.
Okay, did I answer your question?
Okay, well, yeah, so just one clarification on that. I get what you're saying, but just to clarify, no, I did not say, what I said was, at some point, a Rothbardian world is going to be so much richer that, yeah, they can just repel people without hurting them, and it's going to be nothing, technological fix, because they're so much richer. But I said, until they get to that point, they would be vulnerable to, you know, an invasion from like the U.S. or something, and, you know, allied coalition, because look at all these drug operations and money laundering, you know, they'll presumably be happening. And so I'm saying there, we absolutely would not want to be like having tactical nukes and stuff, because that would give a pretext to them. And let me just say, if you think that's naive, and no, look at like what they did to the Branch Davidians. Imagine if the BATF did that to the Quakers. Now maybe they could get away, but it would be a lot harder to sell to the public, whereas the Davidians were stockpiling guns, and so, and they were shooting at the BATFs. And so I think that's how most Americans, Whereas if they went in and just slaughtered a bunch of people that everybody knew, then that's not how those people are not a threat. It would be harder to sell. So on an international scene, it would be harder for the U.S. to carpet bomb little Ancapistan if they really didn't even have weapons at all, and everyone just knew, no, they don't even hurt bank robbers. Are you kidding me? And you took them out because they're a threat to the global order? That's clearly aggression. So
to paraphrase that, you would be passive until you were so strong that you could be passive. So there's like this moment of a switch over.
No, there's no switch. No, I'm passive, period, and then you're coming with a contrived situation where the worst thing in the world, and but in the same token where Tom wouldn't be a libertarian either.
Final question for this young lady in the front. Did you have a question? No? Oh, good. No? You wave your question? Okay, then, that young lady over there has got her hand up. She has the final question. We're actually running overtime because you guys are just relentless in your questions. But please lay it on these guys.
Okay, so I'm hearing a lot of good practical implications of this, but I'm not really hearing the moral superiority, because I guess my question to both of you is what is your moral foundation that each of your positions are built upon, and why is it morally superior to each other? Because if you're both non-aggression principle and that's the basis, it's kind of a wash to me.
Do you guys want to use that great question for your summaries, or do you want to just take it?
Sure. Maybe I'll try, because that's a good one. That's a really good one.
Okay, you want to use that for your summary, Bob, as well?
Sure.
Okay, all right.
Okay, so just to clarify on that one, again, that's why I spent that time going through that scene from Rob Roy, which may have seemed odd to you, but I wanted to just grab a real world example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, where you see someone who would have been within libertarian rights and justified in using defensive violence, but chose not to handle it, diffuse the situation in a way that was, I think, much classier and more elegant, even causing slight damage to himself. He ran his hand on the sword and showed it and said, well done, that he actually cut himself. Okay, so far, it wasn't really he got out of there without any damage. He actually hurt himself a little bit. It's because he had just decided, I could kill this guy, but I choose not to, because that's just, I'm Rob Roy and I'm cool. That's what it is. So that's the sense. So yeah, I don't have, I'm a Christian. So if you say, what's your standard of morality? I say, go read the Sermon on the Mount. And I don't think it's crazy to say, oh, that seems to suggest that you should love your enemy. And, so that's, I don't think bashing girls on the head is loving your enemy, right? And so that's the kind of thing I'm talking about here and dealing with this stuff. So that's, what I'm talking about. I think, and I thought this was going to happen with this debate, where it was going to devolve into a series of scenarios. So again, I just want to make sure I didn't lose you. I know Tom and I talk fast. I want to make sure you understood my response, the way I handled it. It's a very compelling objection he brings up, to say, Bob, oh, so you wouldn't use violence unless something really important to you, namely like your kid's life is on the line, and then you would. Well, now we're just quibbling over where the line is drawn. We all would do something like that. And I'm saying, okay, that's fine, but by the same token, then as I flipped it on him, he also would initiate aggression if he had to. If he couldn't see any way to spare his kid from being harmed by an aggressor without grabbing some third party's gun. So again, to be clear, you didn't get mixed up. He's taking the gun from some bystander who's looking at someone disemboweling his daughter, and the guy has a gun, could stop the aggressor, but for whatever reason doesn't want to, and says, no, this is my gun, you can't use it, and then Tom takes it from him and uses the gun. So Tom stole, and so again, if we're gonna say I'm not really a pacifist and I'm not up here defending pacifism, then Tom's not a libertarian and his whole podcast is a sham, okay? 30 minutes to becoming a smarter statist, that's what his tagline should be. Okay, so here, and again, I'm now trying to, like, up till now I've been showing, wait, it wouldn't be as crazy as it. We're missing something entirely here, and again, this sort of flows out of my Christian perspective, but isn't based on Christianity, but this is where it's coming from. How many people have seen the play Les Mis? Okay, a lot of you. Okay, so remember this scene early on when Valjean, he gets out of prison, he can't find a job because he's tagged as a criminal, and then the bishop has him come into his house. And then the bishop feeds him and stuff, and Valjean, he's ex-con, he can't get a job, he's grizzly and whatever, and then he sees all this silverware that the bishop has because the bishop is wealthy. And then that night, the bishop had let him stay there, Valjean gets up, steals the silverware, and then runs. The police catch him and then drag him back to the bishop. And so there's a neat scene here, just to refresh your memory. They come in and tell his reverend your story. Let us see if he's impressed. You were lodging here last night. You were the honest bishop's guest. Then went out of Christian goodness when he learned about your plight. You maintain he made a present of this silver. And then the bishop comes in and says, that is right. And he turns to Valjean and says, but my friend, you left so early. Surely something slipped your mind. You forgot I gave these also. Would you leave the best behind? And he gives Valjean more silver. Then the bishop turns to the police and says, so, messieurs, you may release him, for this man has spoken true. I commend you for your duty. May God's blessing go with you. Okay, so look at how he handled that situation. He was stolen from, and the way he dealt with it is he gave Valjean more silver. He could have chewed out the cops too, right? He could have said, F the gendarmes, but he didn't, because it's French. He didn't. He commended them for their duties. You see how he took everyone's framework and just diffused that. And the point of that is that that bishop goes through life just with peace and grace, diffusing situations, even at personal cost. Now, why am I bringing? What's the point? What does that serve in that story? That's what makes Valjean the hero. Okay, he wasn't the noble person that we know later from the story, who rescues Cosette and all that stuff and engages in sacrifice. Up till then, he was a normal guy. In fact, became bitter because of what happened to him in prison. And so that's what transforms him, that act of grace. So, of course, Victor Hugo writing that, he's trying to make an analogy to Christianity, right? And so Javert is the one, the nemesis of Valjean chasing him. He represents the law. Valjean was a lawbreaker. He was a criminal. And Javert is going to punish him, and that's what he's doing. That didn't work. That made him more of a criminal, that approach, whereas it was the bishop's scandalous grace and mercy, right? You look at that, you say, no, Valjean doesn't deserve that. He should have been sent back to prison. What a jerk. The guy was nice. The one guy was nice. That's not the point. If you're thinking like that, that's natural. That's understandable. That's how the world seems to work. But the point of what Hugo was trying to do, and the people who made the play, of course, and they're trying to show you that's not the best way to deal with these situations. That's what makes Valjean the hero. So you can have Javert, who tries to break your back with the law, or you can have the bishop who tries to break your heart with scandalous grace and mercy. And in this situation, he's saying that's more effective. That's how you transform people. So you can say Victor Hugo doesn't always talk about it. Leo Tolstoy, the author of War and Peace, understands there's violent people out there. And yet Tolstoy became a pacifist. He inspired Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Okay, so it wasn't because Tolstoy was ignorant of the fact that there's violent people out there. He saw the world as it was. Again, reading War and Peace, he understands humans very well. And yet he realized that, okay, maybe there's a better way to deal with this. So the thing I will end on here, and one other example here, in terms of people being transformed, given second chances, is Tom Woods and I. According to standard libertarian, we used to be neocons. Now, that might not be the term we would have used because it was earlier, but we were in support of the first Gulf War. Under standard libertarian theory, arguably, we were both accessories to mass murder and to institutional theft because we were for taxation. And yet, I think we would say, I'm glad we were given a second chance, and now we're trying to make up for that. We write to right-wing audiences largely to get them to see the problems with that kind of stuff. And so, just to show you that by sparing someone, maybe that's gonna cause far more benefits than throwing him in prison and using violence and trying to minimize the threat. Someone going around just, outpouring because they've seen that grace exercised in the past, that might do a lot, and I think we're underestimating that if we just rely on violence. Thank you.
How much did Tom go, did Bob go over by, Janet?
Yeah, a little bit.
It took about an extra 40 seconds.
Yeah.
Tom, you have an extra 40 seconds.
Okay.
Is Tom gonna sing his response?
Yeah.
He wants to win.
Yes, but it's, no. If I want to win, I will not sing my response, believe me. I actually want to win. All right. I'm quoting Bob from just a few moments ago. The case for violence is much weaker than is conventionally thought. I forgot my timepiece.
Oh.
I doubt I'm gonna need it. I doubt I'm gonna need it. And I know I have the signs, but I still am a control freak about time. Okay, the case for violence is much weaker than is conventionally thought. You know what? I'm gonna be generous and say I think Bob has successfully established that principle with a lot of the examples that he's given us today. Unfortunately, that's not the resolution, but it's a valuable insight, and so when Bob is shaving his beard, he can console himself. He did convey to you something of great moral import today. I would say that I love Les Mis, and that's my favorite scene of the whole production, where the bishop's response is to say, here's more silver for you. You left before you could get the best, because that is an amazing moment of grace, and that is the sort of thing that grace moves one to do. But again, I don't think that has anything to do with the resolution, because I think we evaluate on a case-by-case basis when a response like this is called for and when it is not. For example, some people may need to be repelled in a way that causes them pain. Now, Bob's talking about painless ways of repelling people.